Rainbow trout. Ask most anglers to picture a trout, and this is almost certainly what shows up. Rainbow trout are native to Pacific drainages from Alaska down through Mexico. A pink to red lateral stripe, dense black spotting across the back and fins. What actually made this fish famous has less to do with where it's from and more to do with where it's ended up since. Rainbow trout have been stocked on every continent except Antarctica, introduced to more than 80 countries worldwide, making it the single most widely distributed trout species on Earth by a wide margin. That success came at a cost. Rainbow trout stocked outside their native range have hybridized so extensively with native cutthroat trout that pure cutthroat populations are now genuinely hard to find in some western watersheds. The same trait that made this fish a global hatchery favorite also made it one of the most disruptive freshwater fish humans have ever moved.
Steelhead. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Steelhead and rainbow trout are, genetically, the exact same species. The difference isn't biology, it's life history. Steelhead are rainbow trout that migrate to the ocean, feed and grow there for 1 to several years, then return to their natal river to spawn. And the ocean changes them completely. The bright pink stripe fades to chrome silver, built for camouflage in open water. They grow dramatically larger than their river-resident siblings. The ocean simply offers more food than a freshwater stream ever could. What decides whether a given rainbow becomes a steelhead or just stays put its whole life still isn't fully understood. Even fish from the same parents in the same stream can split down completely different paths. One fish, 2 entirely different lives. Cutthroat trout. This next one isn't really one fish at all. Named for a small, unmistakable slash of red-orange along the underside of the jaw, cutthroat trout are native across much of the western US and into Canada. But cutthroat trout is really a species split into more than a dozen recognized subspecies, each isolated in its own river basin or mountain range, evolving independently for thousands of years. West Slope, Yellowstone, Lahontan, Coastal, each with its own coloring, size, and habitat, shaped entirely by whichever drainage it happened to call home. That isolation, which once protected the species' genetic diversity, has become its greatest weakness. Several subspecies are now threatened, largely from hybridization with the rainbow trout we just covered, and because an isolated population, once compromised, has no neighbor to naturally repopulate from. Some subspecies survive today only because biologists deliberately stocked them into fishless alpine lakes, chosen specifically to keep them separated from rainbow trout for good.
Brown trout. Millions of Americans consider this fish native. It isn't. Brown trout are native to Europe and Western Asia, imported to the US in the 1880s, specifically because they tolerated warmer, more marginal water than native brook trout. They succeeded beyond anything anyone expected, and they're now widely regarded as the hardest trout on this list to consistently fool. Older, larger browns turn notoriously wary and nocturnal, feeding under cover of darkness specifically to avoid anglers. Some anglers joke it's less about convincing a brown trout to bite and more about convincing it you aren't even trying. That difficulty has become the whole appeal among fly anglers, the one species where patience genuinely beats luck, and that same colonizing success is a big part why the naturally hardier brook trout has been pushed out of so many streams across its own historic range. Brook trout. Quick correction before we go further. The brook trout isn't actually a trout, it's a char, taxonomically distinct, a fact most anglers have never heard, despite catching the species their whole lives. Native to eastern North America, brook trout carry pale, worm-like markings across the back, in vivid red spots ringed in blue along the flanks, arguably the most strikingly colored fish on this entire list. Here's what actually separates it from everything else covered so far. Brook trout demand some of the coldest, cleanest water of any fish on this list, which makes them an unusually sensitive indicator of watershed health. A stream that loses its brook trout is very often flagging a bigger problem: warming water, sedimentation, pollution, well before hardier species show any sign of trouble at all.
Lake trout.
Imagine catching a fish older than you are. Lake trout, also technically a char, are the largest species on this list. Some documented individuals exceed 50 pounds. Native to cold, deep lakes across Canada and the northern U.S., they spend most of the year holding at serious depth, sometimes well over 100 feet down, surfacing into shallow water only briefly during the coldest months. Some populations spend so much time down there that individual fish may not encounter meaningful sunlight for months at a stretch. What makes lake trout genuinely remarkable, though, is longevity. Some populations have been documented living past 40 years old, extraordinary for a freshwater fish this size. A truly large lake trout caught today may have been swimming that same lake since before the angler holding the rod was even born. Dolly Varden, named after a brightly dressed character from a Charles Dickens novel, genuinely, that's where the name comes from, this next fish spent decades tangled up in a case of mistaken identity. Dolly Varden are another member of the char genus, native to coastal waters and rivers across Alaska, northern British Columbia, and parts of the Pacific Northwest, marked by pale spots scattered across an olive-green body that brighten to orange and red along the belly during spawning season. For years, Dolly Varden and the very similar-looking Arctic char were lumped together and confused across much of their overlapping range, until closer genetic and morphological study eventually separated them into two distinct species. Like several other char on this list, Dolly Varden can be either resident, staying in fresh water their entire life, or anadromous, migrating to sea and back. The same flexible life history split we saw with Steelhead, just running through an entirely different lineage of the trout and char family tree.
Gila trout. Gila trout are native exclusively to a small number of headwater streams in New Mexico and Arizona, a golden yellow body with faint black spotting that gives it a passing resemblance to its cousin, the Apache trout, covered later on this list. By the mid-20th century, competition from introduced rainbow and brown trout, combined with habitat degradation, had pushed Gila trout down to just a handful of surviving populations, placing it among the first fish ever protected under U.S. endangered species law. Then, in 2006, sustained recovery work paid off enough that Gila trout were formally downlisted from endangered to threatened. Real, measurable progress. And then, tragically, a series of severe wildfires and post-fire ash flows through the Gila wilderness wiped out several of those same recovering populations almost overnight, a stark reminder that for a fish confined to this few streams, recovery is never really finished. It's an ongoing story, not a solved one. Mexican golden trout. Nearly everyone assumes trout diversity stops at the U.S. border. It doesn't. Mexican golden trout are native to a small handful of cold headwater streams in the Sierra Madre Occidental of northwestern Mexico, closely related to the golden and cutthroat trout further north, sharing that same pattern of extreme isolation in high-elevation water. They're considerably less studied than most fish on this list. Limited funding and remote habitat mean researchers still don't have a complete picture of exactly how many distinct populations remain, or how genetically distinct some of them actually are from one another. It's a useful reminder before we head back north. This family's story doesn't stop at a political border, even if most conservation attention and stocking history overwhelmingly has.
Golden trout. Now, the fish nearly everyone actually pictures when they hear golden trout, and its native range is almost absurdly small. California golden trout are native exclusively to a handful of high-elevation streams in the southern Sierra Nevada, confined to a native range covering under 30 square miles in total. Vivid golden-orange flanks, a crimson lateral stripe, dark parr marks that persist into adulthood instead of fading the way most trout markings do with age, it's widely considered one of the most visually striking freshwater fish in North America. Conservation here mirrors the cutthroat story closely. Deliberate stocking into isolated fishless alpine lakes to create backup populations, kept apart from hybridizing rainbow and brown trout because the native range is simply too small to absorb any real setback without permanent loss. Apache trout. This species almost disappeared forever. Apache trout are native exclusively to a small number of high-elevation streams in Arizona's White Mountains. Golden yellow body, a distinctive dark eye stripe. By the mid-20th century, competition and hybridization with introduced rainbow and brown trout had reduced the species to a fraction of its historic range. Here's the turn. Decades of dedicated recovery work, including barriers physically built to block hybridizing species from reaching remaining pure populations, allowed Apache trout numbers to rebound enough that the species became one of the first fish in U.S. history removed from federal endangered protection due to genuine population recovery. Not a legal technicality, not a reclassification, actual fish actually coming back. It's one of the real conservation success stories on this entire list.
Bull trout. We'll close with a fish whose name suggests raw aggression and whose actual story is almost entirely about how little tolerance it has for a warming world. Bull trout, another member of the char genus, are native to cold rivers and lakes across the Pacific Northwest and parts of Canada, apex predators within their native streams. They need some of the coldest water tolerated by any fish on this list, often below roughly 55 degrees Fahrenheit just to spawn successfully, a threshold stricter than almost anything else covered today. That narrow tolerance has made bull trout one of the more visible casualties of habitat fragmentation and gradually warming water, and the species is currently listed as threatened across most of the continental U.S. Some populations migrate over 150 miles between spawning and feeding grounds, which means a single dam or an undersized culvert hundreds of miles from where a population actually spawns can quietly eliminate that population without a single fish ever being directly harmed. It's a quiet decline, no single dramatic event, just a river system slowly losing the narrow conditions this fish has always depended on.